Hello, my name is Skopljanac and I'll be presenting to you today on the topic of bibliotrauma. Let me just share my materials here. As you can hopefully see, my topic is bibliotrauma and memories of literature, and I'll circle back to the title later. This year's IGEL conference theme is diversity and inclusion. And the presentation that I'm going to show responds to that theme by including diverse emotions which are often excluded from our general purview of literature, meaning negative emotions. Because I would contend that as scholars of literature, we tend to focus on the more positive emotions and positive experiences of reading. It has been pointed out recently, I will quote, that negative experiences of reading tend to be marginalized or overlooked, in part at least because researchers of reading are themselves so heavily invested in the idea of reading as beneficial and transformative. End quote. So in order to address the less examined of these opposites, the research I'm going to show will be looking into an archive of hundreds of interviews with contemporary non-professional readers. And I'll be focusing on the most revealing examples of bibliotrauma among them. Bibliotrauma here is a term that I'll define a bit later on, but just for starters, I take it to include any sort of negative emotion which was remembered and recollected by the readers that I'm going to present about here. And as you can see, my research was funded by the Croatian Science Foundation, and it involves 260 adult Croatians. So the entire research was done in Croatian, and I'm not going to go into any of the other data presented here. You can pause the recording and peruse that at your own leisure, and you can email and ask me about it later if you have any additional questions or comments, of course. So the data was elicited through semi-structured interviews, 260 of them, which consisted of 5 parts. And I won't go into the explanation of any of the parts labeled A, B, C, D, E here. You can look at last year's IGEL conference if you're interested in that. I'll just point out 2 questions. So question number 4, did the work evoke any memorable feeling or emotion for you? And question number 14, do you remember ever feeling bad while reading the books you discussed or some others? So these 2 questions were the source of all the subsequent data that will be presented here. And I'll note also that question number 4 was asked in connection to every book that was mentioned by the readers, while connection 14 was asked more generally at the end, at the conclusion of the interviews, and did not focus on any of the books specifically. So having that in mind, I'd like to say something about the emotions in general, first in the research. So there were 944 literary works recollected among the 260 participants, which makes 3.6 such texts on average, and that includes 826 texts and 612 readers. The first point I'd like to make about the data is that only about 80 recollections contained no meaningful response to question 4 at all, so about the memorable feeling of emotion. Conversely, what that means is that 92% of recollections did elicit some general emotional memory in response to question 4. So in other words, an overwhelming majority of the respondents had emotional memories in connection to the books they have read. And in fact, only 2 readers in the whole 260 participant sample had no emotional memories at all among the 6 books they discussed. So a very obvious conclusion here is that readers tend to remember the books they have read quite emotionally. What about the negative emotions? Well, that's a more general question, which also involves the issues of are there any general emotions in general? If so, how to define them and what to call them? One of the psychologists which answered that very difficult call was Robert Plutchik, and his widely used circumplex model is quite often employed to show such emotions in studies of various kinds. I'd like to note here that Plutchik's circumplex model, in fact, only defines the so-called primary emotions, not the dyads, so not the combinations, although you'll find a lot of sources working exactly with that, including the PyPlutchik library that I used to create these images. But I'll stick to Plutchik's original article, which only includes the 8 basic emotions, 4 among which can be defined as negative. So how does that work in Plutchik and in connection to the data that has been collected by my colleagues and myself? You can see that here. So 104 participants, or roughly 40%, mentioned at least one of the emotions below, so one of the negative emotions, without being asked specifically about negative emotions. So again, if you ask readers questions about the emotions they remember from reading, 60% of the emotions roughly will be positive, but 40 will be negative. 167 participants further, or 64%, so roughly 2/3, mentioned at least one of the emotions below while being asked specifically about negative emotions, so in response to question 14. When you put these two figures together, so 104 and 167, and exclude any overlap, you get a total of 200 participants, or roughly 3/4 of the sample, who mentioned at least one of the negative emotions while discussing 282 texts involved. 140 of them were female and 60 of them were male, so 70% and 30%, which coincides very well with the general gender makeup of the sample. Female readers, of course, are more present in European populations, so that was reflected in the Croatian sample as well. So I would focus here only on the primary emotions, as I said, defined by Plutchik in his inaugural article, and those are the ones that are bolded here. So, for instance, anger is the middle, is in the middle between annoyance and rage when it comes to the intensity of the emotion. So less intense anger is annoyance, more intense anger is rage. And if you look at the emotions which are mentioned the most in the research, they I would say, complement Plutchik's emotions remarkably well. So the ones mentioned more often are put here in bold. So anger at 58 mentions, fear at 64 mentions or recollections, sadness at 179, the most by far, and disgust at only 25. If you look at it visually, using Plutchik's circumplex model, here's the breakdown. And the positive emotions here are all set to 0.5 and are not highlighted, as are the negative emotions. So, for instance, anger at 0.03 recollections, when you express it between 0 and 1, includes, so annoyance at 0.03, then anger at 0.22, and rage at 0.05. So rage at the characters and anger about the characters, most often it was narratives, and annoyance at the characters. Same goes for disgust, sadness, and fear. So two conclusions here. One, as I already mentioned, the data overlaps, that is what readers remember as negative emotions from their texts, from the text they have read, is very consistent with Plutchik's basic primary emotions. And that's also the second conclusion. So very consistent with the primary emotions. So only here with fear, at 0.1, you can see a larger prevalence of apprehension, for instance, that is mentioned 27 times, but still less than half of fear itself mentioned. So the primary emotions were dominating in both senses of the word. So both as both intensity-wise and frequency-wise. So what do you make of all this data? Well, I like to answer that question with looking more into the texts themselves. And the texts were remembered in broad accordance with how often they were mentioned or recollected in general. I hope you can see that. You can probably pause and zoom in, but I'd like to have the whole picture here presented. So I chose the top 4 texts mentioned in the research and ordered them here by order of negative recollection. So Anna Karenina, Tolstoy's novel, was mentioned the most times as in connection to a negative emotion, so rank 1 here in square brackets, but also in general recollections, so just general mentions of the novel, so not having anything to do with emotions at all. It was mentioned 14 times, which gives it rank 2, right behind Crime and Punishment, which was mentioned 27 times among the 260 respondents, which gives it rank 1. And rank 2 in negative recollections. The other 2 texts are Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend. So all 4 novels written in the 19th and 20th centuries. I like to focus on only 2, for lack of time, only 2 recollections by the readers. And I'd like to mention here only briefly in passing that only 2 of these are made by males. So 2 of them by reader 252 here, a male of 20 years old, and another by R21, so reader 21, male 33 years of age. And as I mentioned before, this seems to be an accident of the data. So it's not that female readers are more emotionally negative. It's just that there's more of them. Same thing going for these novels. It doesn't. I can't say for sure that these novels elicit more negative responses before getting more data, and this is about a quarter of the total. So the full research will hopefully involve 1,000 Croatian readers, and then I'll be able to offer more non-provisional conclusions. But working with the data in hand, I'd just like to focus on the underlined quotes here. So they're in single quotes because they're paraphrases done by me of the actual answers. So sadness and frustration caused by the events did not make the reading experience negative. It was just the opposite. Frustrated by the sad ending, so I took part in a short story contest in which I rewrote it as a happy end. A plethora of emotions, but no warm ones. Anger, rage, sadness, understanding for the protagonist and his mad act. Nervous, eerie, afraid, anxious. The city bears down on him, or Raskolnikov, the protagonist. It's all right to feel sad while reading. Frustrated because it was so difficult to keep track of the narrative and the lexicon. And the last 2, happiness, sadness, exhilaration because of the beauty, questioning my own relationships and friendship, and nostalgic for Naples, anger because of gender inequality. So what to make of these recollections? I like to employ 2 methodological tools here. One is Thomas Beebe's broader definition of bibliotrauma. He has 3 layers or 3 levels, I would say, of definition. I only focus on the second one, so the incitement or amplification of unexamined negative emotions by literary texts. And the second one is Rita Felsky's concept of attachment, which focuses on extratextual ways in which readers attach themselves to books. I would argue that both are quite present and represented here, not just in the underlined quotations, but in the majority of the quotations, which obviously I can't all present and represent here. I would just like to focus on a few again. So, sadness and frustration caused by our events did not make the reading experience negative, it was just the opposite. So there's a sense of pushback here. In fact, 26 of the readers question our own questions, so of negative emotions. They would say, in words of one reader, that negative emotions are required for their readings. They call them pleasant unpleasantness, which makes you feel, which makes you grow as a person. So these emotions are present here, I would say, in a mixed, sometimes even negative and positive at the same time, bucket of emotions, so to speak. So they're present in a plethora of ways, as one of the readers said. So a plethora of emotions are evoked by texts, and usually it's just one sort of so only on one polarity, so only either positive or negative, as here, but also quite often mixed. So as in this example here, for instance, just a question, just a second. Generally felt good, mixed with awe, wonder, sometimes sadness. So that would be an example of sadness figuring very little. Another conclusion that I can put together based on this data is that negative emotions seem to inspire reflection and self-reflection, as seen very well here, I would say, in this quote. And that would also suggest that readers make strong attachments to text based not just on emotions, not just on negative or positive emotions, but also based on their own life circumstances. So my own relationships and friendships, and even their acts. So, for instance, again, this reader who rewrote the ending of Anna Karenina, which she thought frustrating, so she could enjoy it as a happy ending. So, again, this is a very strong example, I would say, of a very personal, very specific attachment to a text via negative emotions. These, of course, weren't the only emotions. So not just Plutchik's emotions were involved in the research in the answers. I listed the other negative and even positive emotions here. I put them under several headings, and I've bolded the ones, that is, I put in bold the ones that occur most often. So general emotion of feeling unpleasant or disturbing, off-putting, frustrating, and so on by the text. Clocked in at 89 count, the count of 89, so 89 recollections. And another put under heading 6, the general negative emotion of longing, which included mostly melancholy and nostalgia, had 27 recollections. So these had to be taken into consideration as well. But again, for lack of time, I'll move on straight to the conclusions of which try to respond basically to two questions that I set out with in preparing this presentation. So question number 1, which negative emotions usually appear and how often? And question number 2, how do readers usually react to such emotions? And conclusion number 1 has something to state about both of these questions. So non-professional readers hold diverse opinions on what constitutes negative emotions, as well as what their connection to literature should be. So the connection of negative emotions to literature. And there are roughly 3 camps of readers that you can make out here. One of them avoids negative emotions scrupulously. And again, you can pause and read all these answers. The other balances between the positive and the negative ones. And the third one seems to be actively seeking negative emotions as the gist of reading, one might say. 2 more conclusions can be brought up. One is that negative emotions definitely do appear during literary reading and are well remembered later. In fact, they appear in roughly half, I would say, of all the recollections made by readers. So, I'm sorry for the typo here. So all the emotions all the responses in general involve almost all of the emotions, excuse me, one last time. Almost all of the responses in general involve some sort of emotions, and about half of them involve negative emotions. So roughly half of all the texts that are remembered well by readers are remembered so precisely because of negative emotions. And those are the ones primarily identified by Plutchik. So in order of appearance, sadness, and then a general sense of unpleasantness, fear, anger, longing, disgust, shock, malaise, and so on. The third conclusion here is that negative emotions about literary texts are remembered as a complex mixture of emotions which are usually embraced by the readers. So they seem to coalesce as long-term episodic memories, which sometimes exhibit specific types of attachment. They often consist of a bibliotraumatic core, sometimes overlaid with a eudaimonic outer layer, meaning that the negative emotions is at the center, but that pushback I mentioned earlier, that feeling that negative emotions are to be sought and that they bring some sort of positive outcome is quite present among the readers in the research. And there are various ways of explaining this seeking out. This is a phenomenon that other researchers have, of course, looked into. I'll just mention a few of the most logical and well-known explanations. The first one, of course, Aristotle's catharsis, but also another one I think is pointed out quite clearly in the answers themselves, is so-called post-traumatic growth or personal traumatic growth. So the idea that a person can, as I said, grow and learn something from a trauma exhibited in a text. There's also the idea of downward social comparison, or emotions training us in ways on how to deal with them. And you can look all these up in the excellent edited volume, The Eudaimonic Turn, Well-Being in Literary Studies, if you're interested. What I would like to conclude with ultimately is, of course, that all this leads to the overarching conclusion that negative emotions determine a significant part of the reader's general experience of literature. And now going back to the very title, as I mentioned, All My Characters Die. This quote here is from a reader who mentioned with a lot of, I would say, irony, that the books she remembered well, the content of the books she remembered well, was interlaced with sadness, with tragedy. And I would also say, generalizing from the data presented here, that a rich experience of literature actually requires at least some characters to die. So maybe not all of them, but at least some. And conversely, it requires us as readers to feel in turn sad, disturbed, afraid, and angry about the character's death. Just as at the end, writers all the way from Homer to Tolstoy and Elena Ferrante seem to have known all along. Thank you for your attention and your patience. And again, if you have any questions and comments, please feel free to direct them to my email address. Thank you once again for your attention, and goodbye.